Hey, welcome to the year 2024. As solo podcasters, one thing we all struggle with, and that is how to deliver our message without sounding too preachy. So today, I'm going to tell you 5 ways on how you, as a solo podcaster, can make that happen.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on my little website, which I built all by myself. You can check that out at chrisandchristineshow.com. There's a link to it, in the show notes of this very episode. You can scroll on down, and there it is. And over on the Chris and Christine Show, we are back, baby. We are back. We have got brand new episodes happening right now over there with brand new guests. I'm going to go ahead and check that out. They are live on the website right now. We got more in the works. We are back to our regular podcasting schedule, although we took a little break for a little while while we got things dialed in, especially going through the holidays and things like that. And we are back to podcasting. And do not feel that if you take a break from your podcast, sometimes it's okay to take a break. Podcasting is just like anything else that you can get burnt out if you go like a daily show, for goodness. I mean, who does daily shows? Every time I've heard anybody do a daily show, they immediately get burnt out. So anyways, we are back to podcasting over there. And I want to say thank you once again for being here on Podtastic Audio, the show which I've created to help you create your show. That's what Podtastic Audio is all about. And I love podcasting. I love the concept of podcasting. I love audio formats. I love content creation in general, whether it's YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, whatever, however you create content for your audience. It's amazing. It's great to be here. It's great to be here in a brand new year, 2024. Wow, this is going to be an amazing year. I feel it. 24 is my year. In fact, when I go to the casinos and play roulette, I always put money down on 24. And now that it is the year 2024, maybe it's going to be more fun to actually put money down on the number 24 during this year. How amazing is that? But almost as equally amazing is your great, wonderful podcast. How is that podcast of yours coming along? Are you enjoying podcasting, or do you see your podcast as some great big chore on your to-do list that you keep pushing off and pushing off? Like, I'll get to the podcast eventually. And that's what happens when we take these breaks and we kind of wonder, when are we coming back from this podcast break? And you're saying, well, I'm not quite pod faded yet. Not quite there yet. Well, I'll get to it when I get to it. And maybe you host your show on like a free platform like Spotify for podcasters or one of the many different places like that. So you're not paying a monthly hosting service. So you don't think about it. You're like, well, I'm not paying anything. It's the same thing with YouTube also. If you put your show like exclusively on YouTube, which is entirely free, you're thinking, well, if you take a break, you take a break. It's not costing you any money to host there. It's not costing you any money to take a break. But if you're paying like $20 to $50 monthly hosting fees, and you see those hit your bank statement every month, you're like, well, I better get over there and start podcasting because it's costing me a fortune if I don't podcast. And that's probably why a lot of these, back in the day, Anchor, now Spotify for podcasters type of shows, that's why a lot of those shows, pod faded so easily. Super easily, because they think they're going to make a bunch of money. They're going to be super famous, so on and so forth. Whatever your idea of podcast success is, if it doesn't happen in the first 5 episodes, people get upset and they leave. And if they do not have any money invested, then what's the point of staying? They have no investment at all. Then they're just going to leave. That's usually what happens. but I do not want you to leave. I want you to continue podcasting, and I want to help you figure that out because I think podcasting is a wonderful platform to get your message out. You have something to say, an audience is waiting for you to say it. But what are some of the best practices on how to make a podcast not only just be recorded and put out, but how do you make your own personal podcast sound relatable, sound conversational, sound personal to your particular listener? And that's the key to all of this, is make sure when you are recording a podcast, the audience who's listening to that podcast of yours, they feel connected. They feel like you're their best friend. When the listener is listening to you talk on your podcast, they want to feel a connection. They want to feel like it is an inviting conversation between you and the listener. You know, recently somebody once told me that on this show here, Podtastic Audio, that I do the show in a very much a conversational style that does not sound too preachy. Now, when I heard those words, I was saying too preachy, huh? So I think a lot of other shows, they will just get up here and talk as if they're talking to almost like a presentation, like they're giving a presentation at a news conference or a conference of some sort, and there's up at the podium just speaking facts right into the microphone. They're just not having any dialogue or inflections or any personality. They're just up there just reading a script. And I think some shows, especially solo shows, do that. So I'm kind of thinking that what do I do that's different? I think one of the things that I do is that I actually, when I'm talking, to you directly through the podcast, I'm not just reading a script verbatim, just spitting out facts and data like a news anchor, on a news show. That's not what I do. I'm trying to keep things personal and relatable. So today I have 5 ways on how you can create a podcast, especially a solo podcast, how you can inject some kind of conversational tone into your solo show to make sure that you don't sound too preachy on your podcast for your listeners, because that will definitely tune them out. So the first way on how to make sure your solo podcast has more of a conversational tone is to invite listener participation. You see, if you have listeners participate on your show, people love hearing something that they wrote in or something that they physically said and you played it back on the podcast. Listeners actually love that stuff. So you want to encourage listener participation by posing questions, inviting feedback, and sharing stories or comments directly from your audience. If somebody writes in to you and you read their story on your podcast, they're going to love it because it creates a sense of community and makes your podcast feel more like a conversation between you and your audience than just a single one-sided monologue, because monologues are code for boring. So moving on to the second way that you can use personal tone and make your podcast feel more conversational is, personal. You can share personal anecdotes. Integrate personal anecdotes and experiences into your content. Now, one thing I've always said about your content and your podcast, the common denominator for your podcast, guess what? Yeah, that's you. You see, you can share relevant stories that help illustrate your points or provide context to the topics you discuss. Now, this personal touch makes your podcast more relatable and less like a lecture. Now, the lecture shows are the ones that I've been hearing that a lot of podcasters kind of fall into, that lecture kind of talk. Maybe it's because all they ever know is they go to school, they go to college, university, wherever, and the professor is up there giving the lecture talk to the classroom. Now, if you've ever been inside one of those lectures, people are tuning out, droning out. Maybe they're taking notes, maybe they're not. But one thing is almost certain is that a lot of them, there's a big disconnect between the actual classroom and the teacher because they are just like bored out of their minds. You don't want to sound like a lecture when you podcast, especially on a solo show. So moving on to the number 3 spot on how to make your show sound more personal, inviting, and less like a lecture is to use inclusive language. Now, what does that really even mean? It means that you want to be mindful of your language and use inclusive terms instead of coming across as an authoritative or saying my way is the only way and I'm right and high and mighty me. You want to use phrases that convey openness and invite different perspectives. This helps listeners feel like they're part of the discussion rather being lectured to. And it's all about trying to avoid that whole lecture talk. You want to have your listeners feel as if you are talking directly to them, having a conversation with them. Be inclusive in the way that you talk to them. So, moving on to number 4. Now, this is a good one because it's one thing that a lot of podcasters are almost afraid of doing on their shows because they don't want to be vulnerable and authentic. You see, you want to embrace vulnerability and authenticity. Share your thoughts, your doubts, your uncertainties on certain topics. This will humanize you as a podcaster and show that you are not claiming to have all the answers. You see, listeners, they appreciate honesty. They appreciate authenticity and relatability. If you can relate directly to your audience, if your audience sees you and hears you and they're like, you know what, I get that guy because he says things that I'm thinking and it feels like he is on the same playing field that I am. I relate to this person. He is telling me the truth. I believe things he says. He's not trying to BS me. He's not trying to be something he's not. So the audience is like, yeah, I get him. I relate. And he is being very authentic. And authenticity is going to be a big game changer when it comes to things that are generated by AI versus an actual person. You see, AI, a ChatGPT script or an AI generated podcast, they cannot inject personality. So one way for your podcast to be relatable to your audience is to physically be relatable to your audience. So the 5th and final way that you can be more personable and be more relatable to your podcast audience doing solo shows is if you break the 4th wall. Now, if you're not familiar with the 4th wall is have you ever seen a movie where you're watching the movie and they're doing the movie scene on the screen and one of the actors will turn directly to the camera and talk to you, the audience sitting at home, like, hey, by the way, you're going to, get your popcorn ready for this scene. Here it comes. And then they go back into the scene of the movie. Some shows do that. I know Ferris Bueller's Day Off, when it came out in the 80s, they did that a lot in that movie. And there's probably other movies out there I just can't think of at the top of my head right now that actually do break the 4th wall. You see, breaking down the imaginary 4th wall by acknowledging your audience directly, just like they do in the movies. So how could you do that with an audio podcast? Well, let me show you. So, for example, here, let's just say you can use phrases like, I know many of you might be thinking that, this podcasting stuff is extremely easy and I make it look so much easier than it really is. Or perhaps maybe you can say something like, I've received feedback from listeners who feel that their podcast is not growing, although they're spending lots of time and energy on equipment and gear and so on and so forth. Let's help you out. Let's tell you how I can help you figure out how to do that. You see, this acknowledgement creates a sense of connection and makes the audience feel like they are active participants in this real conversation that we are having right now. So those are the 5 tips on how you, as a solo podcaster, can maintain a conversational style and tone with your audience. You want to be relatable. You want to be more authentic with your audience. You don't want to BS your audience. Your audience is like your personal family. You want to treat them with the utmost respect and dignity And you want to make sure that when you are talking directly to your audience, like I'm talking directly to you, you want to make sure that it doesn't sound too preachy, like it sounds like it's coming from a pulpit. You don't want to sound like you're giving a lecture to a class, even though technically a lot of shows still do that. They are literally lectures in an audio format. And you know what? Just because I'm feeling fun, I'm going to give you one extra bonus tip, just free. This one's on the house. So the bonus tip is this. Hey, why not just mix up the format? Mix things up. You can experiment with different format styles of your episodes. You can incorporate interviews, of course, solo reflections. Yeah, interviews, solo, however you do it. You can do a Q&A sessions. You can even read back listener feedback directly on the episode. However you want a podcast, it's really your show. Do it however you want. Don't be afraid to change things up, mix things up, mix up the format. Mixing it up can add a variety and prevent the podcast from feeling, just a basic same old every single episode. Change it up. Get excited about your show. Remember, the goal is to create a podcast that feels like a friendly conversation rather than a sermon. By incorporating these tips, you can foster a sense of connection with your audience and make your solo podcast more enjoyable and more relatable. And I think that's why all of that I just said is probably a little harder for people to put in practice versus a, interview style of a show, which is probably why the interview style shows are extremely popular. Just because, everybody is doing the interview style show does not mean you have to do an interview style show. Listen, I love doing both. I can do either or. Whatever works for me. The benefits of doing a solo show is that I'm not waiting on anybody to meet me at a certain time on a certain day of the week and set all that stuff up. I can record this show anytime that I'm available, not the guest, not whatever. When I am available to record, I can physically record. I'm only waiting on me and my schedule. So if you have multiple co-hosts or multiple guests, you're trying to coordinate different things, it can be a big mess sometimes. I get it. I go through it with the Chris and Christine show, with the scheduling of our schedules, making sure that we have time to physically record here and then bring in guests and work with their time schedules and try to figure things out. Thank goodness for Calendly. That really saved our butt. There's no way it'd be impossible to do multiple guests on a single solo recording without Calendly. Now, if you're not familiar with Calendly it's a booking platform, scheduling platform, which you send out a link to your guests or whoever. It doesn't matter if it's a guest or it can be a partner. It could be anything. You send it out to them. You pick the days and times that you are available. They see it. They only can choose those times which you have pre-selected, when you are available to do the thing. So you do that, they come back, it gets sent on everyone's calendar, it gets sent in your calendar, goes your email, everybody gets notified, everybody agrees on a certain day and time to show up and where to show up. It's fantastic. But listen, if you do not want to deal with all that mess, you always can do a solo show. And just because people say, you got to have a podcast with a guest, or I want to interview with these people or that people, you always got to think of why are you interviewing these people? Why are they on your show? Is it because they are famous? You got to have something more than just that, because that alone will not get listeners to come in and stick around. I don't think they will do that. There's got to be a reason. If Celebrity X came into your show to talk about something that is relatable to your show, if your show is about dog walking and dog grooming, you love animals, you love dogs, great. If you have a celebrity come on your show who talks about their own personal dogs and the dogs they have and the dogs they love, then yeah, that makes sense. But if a celebrity is going to come on to talk about something completely off the wall that has nothing to do with your podcast, then you should not have them come on. Each person that comes onto your show, there should be a reason they are there. Serve your audience. Your audience comes to you to listen to whatever your show is about. So don't sway them off the beaten path into something obscure that has nothing to do with your show. I don't think I'd have somebody come on here that was not going to talk about podcasting. This show is about podcasting. So anybody and everything I have on this show is podcasting related. So as we enter a brand new year, 2024, I want to wish you all the best of luck on your podcast. And listen, you always can email me or reach out to me on social media. And if you have any questions about your podcast, or maybe if we have time, maybe we can schedule things. Maybe I could be a guest on your podcast. I'm always willing to do that, depending on the time and all that kind of stuff. All the typical logistics that go into recording any kind of podcast for that matter. So until next time, happy podcasting.